So, hi everyone. It's myself and my colleague Sarah Campbell presenting today. We are and work for the organisation LGBTQ plus human rights charity Stonewall. My name's Carla. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Sarah. I'm the head of empowerment at Stonewall. My pronouns are also she and her. And yeah, we're really excited to have this chance to talk to you a little bit more about Stonewall's work and LGBT inclusion in the workplace more generally.
My name's obviously I already said my name is Carla, but my role is Workplace Partnerships Manager. I'm going to just frame this conversation a little bit around our history of Stonewall. Some of you may have heard of us, some of you may not know as much. So we were founded by a group of activists in the late 1980s in response to a piece of legislation at that time known as Section 28. So Section 28 was introduced in 1988, and we were then founded in 1989 with the aim of repealing Section 28. So our history was founded around this local government act that banned the so-called promotion of homosexuality in schools, and what that did obviously was hugely stigmatise lesbian, gay and bi people. So one of the founding members of our organisation, as you can see pictured there on the left, was Sir Ian McKellen. And as of today, we are the largest lesbian, gay, bi and trans charity in Europe. Moving on to the next slide then, please. Thanks. So we, as I mentioned, so we were founded around 32 years ago. We have fought against lots of different legislation, such as the legislation that we're currently fighting to change is the Gender Recognition Act and hate crime legislation. So it's also important to note that we're working just as hard to protect laws as we were when we were fighting to change laws. So in recent years, we've seen countries around the world roll back LGBTQ plus rights, for instance, in the USA, Brazil, Hungary, and we're working hard to make sure that doesn't happen also in the UK. So in our 32 years, we've successfully helped campaign for, in the year 2000, the ban on lesbian, gay and bi people serving in the military, which was lifted. 2001, the age of consent was made equal. 2003, Section 28 was repealed. Protections in the workplace was in 2003 as well. 2004, the Civil Partnerships Act. 2007, protections in goods and services. Equal access to fertility treatment was in 2008, hate crime protections to 2010, as well as the Equality Act in 2010 and the Equal Marriage Act in 2013. In 2015, we became trans inclusive as an organisation and started campaigning for trans rights as well as LGBT rights, as we were initially founded on. And as well as that, we have been part of the arc of change in LGBT people serving in the military, employment protection, same-sex parent adoption, our Rainbow Laces campaign, which is our biggest mass reach campaign, as you can see there on the far right. Working on LGBTQ plus inclusion in sport was launched in 2013, and we are currently running a campaign as I'm sure lots of you have seen, to ban conversion therapy in the United Kingdom. So as I mentioned, in 2015, we became fully trans inclusive. We consulted with trans communities and charities at that time. We set up the Trans Advisory Group to ask if the trans community wanted us to represent them, and if so, how are we going to do that? This resulted in our 5-year manifesto, which we call the Vision for Change, and that really looks at holding us to account as an organisation for our work around trans inclusion. So we are now a lesbian, gay, bi and trans and Q plus charity and human rights NGO, and our trans equality work is reflected in every area, department and campaign of who we are as Stonewall. Very recently, and many of you may have seen in the press and in the media, we have launched a new strategy, which we refer to as the Free to Be strategy. That's our 2021 to 2025 strategic goals and objectives. So At Stonewall, we stand for all lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, question, and ace people. We imagine a world where LGBTQ plus people everywhere are free to be themselves and can live their lives to the full. And we know that as part of a vibrant global movement for change made up of LGBTQ plus people, our allies, families, and friends, that we will get there together. In terms of more information around that and how we work, so we, as I was recapping at the beginning and framing this conversation around our history, we were founded in 1989. We now work in each nation of the United Kingdom and have established partnerships across the globe. We are working with our communities, our partners, and as well, very importantly, our allies, to learn together and support each other, which is at the heart of our approach. So our three main strategic pillars are freedom, equity, and potential. So freedom, obviously, from a human rights perspective, tells a very powerful story about the kind of world we choose to live in and the kind of world we want to build. We at Stonewall imagine a world where LGBTQ plus people have the same rights as everybody else, where the law of our home countries and our countries internationally shield us from harm and protect us to live openly, unapologetically, and proudly. The equity stream of this strategic pillar in our Free to Be strategy then looks at, when we think of equity, we imagine a world where all LGBTQ plus people experience justice. This means not only equal opportunities, but equitable outcomes. So we recognize that equitable outcomes look different for each of us and that many of us face different barriers in our lives based on our identity and experiences. And that is obviously a nod towards intersectionality, which we will come on to discuss slightly later. And the potential pillar of our strategy then is looking at our belief that LGBTQ plus people across the world and across every stage of our lives have limitless potential. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Sarah now to talk about the importance of inclusive workplaces, and I will come back to talk about my team who deal with workplace inclusion from a slightly different lens.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Carla. So a massive part of Stonewall's work and a key part of everyone's lives, I think, is looking at the workplace. We spend a significant amount of our time at work. The things we learn there, the way we feel there plays a huge part in shaping us as people, but also in our well-being and how much we enjoy our lives and can achieve our potential. So we work with 850 organisations in the UK and around the world to look at their LGBT inclusion practices, to help them look at their organisations and understand where there might be blockers, barriers, opportunities for LGBT people to thrive. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we do that and a little bit of framing of first steps that people might want to look at or take briefly now. Just a heads up that the next slide contains some statistics about people's experiences at work. And as you can imagine, why we're all here is that that's not always brilliant. So just want to give you a bit of a content warning ahead of there to look after yourself in whatever way works for you. Only last a minute or so. So if you want to head out and come back, please feel free to do so. So this research is taken from Stonewall's LGBT in Britain report. We ground everything we do in research and everything we do in an understanding of the LGBT community, their needs, their experiences, because it's such an under-researched part of our lives. There's such limited research out there that LGBT people's experiences. So when we asked LGBT people about their experiences in the workplace, almost 20% said they'd experienced negative comments or conduct at work because they're LGBT. 35% of LGBT people in the UK have hidden their sexual orientation or gender identity at work because they're afraid of discrimination. 38% of bi people aren't out to anyone at work about their sexual orientation. And the most shocking one of all, that 12% of trans people and 10% of BAME LGBT people have been physically attacked by customers or colleagues because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Physical safety is a baseline, right, that we should be able to expect when we go into work, but LGBT people are not experiencing that all the time. And I think it's really important to take the final statistic in the context of the second two, that if a lot of people are hiding who they are, at least at some point in work, how many of these instances are actually being reported for what they are? And I think when we think about hiding ourselves, when we think about not being out at work, we sometimes think about that as quite a small thing, not telling someone about one element of your life. But actually, when we think about it, that feeds through into every conversation you have, feeds through into you're talking about your holiday, you're talking about your experiences, you're talking about your ideas and your thoughts and your reflections. It changes the way you engage with the workplace and your colleagues. And it has a real impact on people. So this is not this inability to be out, and obviously not everybody can hide their identity or can hide their identity to a greater or lesser extent. But for those that can, there are real impacts to not being yourself at work. It creates barriers in your relationships. You waste your energy, right? You're constantly thinking about whether or not you're going to be outed, whether or not someone's going to accept you, understand you. That energy people are not spending on getting on in their job and getting on with their work. It impacts on teams' creativity. If you're thinking before you speak every time, you're not throwing all of your ideas out there, you're not having a chance to have your say in team conversations. It's really isolating, and you're living with that fear of being outed all the time. But we can't just say to LGBT people, come out, tell everybody who you are, tell everybody all about your life, the challenges you face, the opportunities you have, the brilliance and joy and the celebration of your life, because we know from the previous slide that not all workplaces are inclusive. They're not all safe, comfortable spaces for LGBT people to be themselves. And being yourself in an environment that isn't inclusive is potentially just as bad as not being yourself. So you're living with bullying or the fear of bullying, and coupled with the inability to talk about that for what it is a lot of the time. Or being the trans one or the gay one or the lesbian one that everybody picks to be on panels, that everybody comes to when they have a question or whenever they see a news story about LGBT people. And that leads to tokenism, right? It leads to you being valued for your identity, not for who you are as a person. And it's isolating, and it hinders your career development as well. We know that LGBT people do not progress through organizations and progress through careers at the same rate as their cis and heterosexual peers. So what we're looking for is an inclusive environment, right? It's actually more about the space around LGBT people than LGBT people themselves. And that's something we, as LGBTQ plus people and non-LGBTQ plus people, can all have an influence on to a greater or lesser extent. And that creates the freedom to be yourself, that knowledge you're protected by strong and inclusive policies, closer relationships with the people around you. People build stronger teams. They have each other's back. They understand what's going on in each other's lives. Closer relationships and higher team outputs, right? If everybody can get their heads down and think about what they actually need to be thinking about, it makes a real difference to the strength of that team and what they're able to achieve. And it results in higher discretionary work and job satisfaction. And I think we shouldn't have to make a business case for LGBTQ plus equality. We're talking about human rights. But the baseline is that it does make incredibly good business sense to have an inclusive organization. Makes a difference to the people you can attract and retain. You're drawing from a much wider pool. Believe me, LGBT people are always searching an organization's website for what's available to them, how inclusive an organization is. And I know this from previous experience. My first job was a place where I absolutely could not be myself. And I got a year in and I thought, you know what, this isn't worth it. This is not somewhere I need to be. There are other opportunities which will enable me to kind of fulfill my potential and actually be who I am on a daily basis. It creates trust from customers and service users. Not everyone's LGBTQ plus, but most people know an LGBTQ plus person, care about them, are family members, friends, members of the community, and building that authentic trust that you actually respect and engage with the LGBTQ plus community goes a really long way. It improves employee satisfaction, well-being, mental health measurements go up when people are able to be themselves in the workplace, and better credibility externally, right? As well as improved decision-making. We've all seen where this has gone wrong, when people have not had the right people around the table to make a decision, and the backlash that causes, because you're not representing the whole community, you're not representing everybody who's looking at your brand, your organization, your products. So what do we do about this? How do we achieve this kind of utopian inclusive organization? It's a lot of work, it's a lot of energy, a lot of engagement, a lot of kind of challenging conversations actually for a lot of people, but there are brilliant first steps that people can take. So these would be a few of my initial suggestions. Starting by looking at your policies. Your policies are kind of the law in your organization in a way, right? And having it written down in there that LGBT people specifically are protected from bullying and harassment, having clauses in parental leave documents that say this applies to everybody's relationships, and it explicitly applies to trans people, using gender neutral language throughout your parenting policies, allowing for bereavement leave for chosen family as well as biological family. That goes a long way to showing people that they are understood by the organisation, and not letting those policies gather dust on a shelf, having them regularly reviewed and renewed, and making sure everybody knows actually how to use them. Thinking about a senior champion, who at the top of your organization believes in this, why do they believe in it, and how can you support them to effectively kind of work towards creating a more inclusive organization, and having those conversations at a really senior level. Learning from your monitoring data, if you have any, if you don't, trying to find some, but understanding what the numbers are telling you. What are LGBT people experiencing in your organization, and where do you need to target your efforts to create a more inclusive organization? Engaging people in training. Every single person in an organization has a role to play in LGBTQ plus inclusion. And it's really important that they are empowered to do so, and that they've had the chance to ask their questions, to understand what that means for them, and increase their level of understanding of the LGBT community. And establishing a network group if you don't have one already. Network groups are an incredible resource, both for peer support for your LGBTQ plus colleagues, but also as a driving force for inclusion in the organization. You can work with them to improve pretty much everything you do around LGBTQ plus equality. And if you're too small, that doesn't work for you, finding an inter-organizational network that you can be a part of and join and add your voice and your thoughts to it, and get the similar benefits that you would get from your own LGBTQ plus network. I'm going to pass back to Carla to talk about the work that her team does to make this stuff a reality with organizations.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So how do we support organizations? How do we work with organizations such as many of yourselves that will be watching and participating in this webinar? Well, the truth is we do it in many different ways. One of which is Sarah's team, and she's touched on some of that, and one of which is the workplace team, which is the team that I'm a part of. So essentially, we are committed to creating a work environment free of all forms of harassment, bullying, and intimidating behavior, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So by creating a positive, inclusive, and professional sharing work environment for all, we can ensure our people and organizations are able to maximize the benefits of our of the relationship with us as Stonewall. So one of the ways that we do that is via our Diversity Champions program. So as Sarah mentioned, we inform and structure all of our work via research that we conduct. So the Diversity Champions program is the longest running and leading evidence-based LGBTQ plus inclusion program of its kind. We have over 850 diversity champions working towards positive change. So that ranges from a wide range of sectors, both within the UK and globally. So the DC program, as we refer to it, was created to work with organizations to create a mindset and attitude of inclusion within their walls and throughout the work that they do internally, externally, and in their community. So we know that the same people who participate in workplaces then go out to participate in wider society. How can we make those people, through education and awareness, through advice on that's rooted in the legislation, the Equality Act, how can we make those spaces a safe space and inclusive of all identities, encouraging employees to give their best and allowing them to bring their full selves and therefore full skills, capabilities, and creativity to work. So how does the program work? What are some of the membership features? So essentially, you would get a dedicated client account manager, a dedicated point of contact and support, things like policy reviews, which Sarah was mentioning and nodded to earlier, networking with any of the 850 plus organizations that are members, awareness raising, digital learning sessions, and LGBTQ plus network group support. We also have expertise and resources. We also have a memberships hub and portal that our members get access to, which is an online directory of resources available exclusively to Diversity Champion members, which you can access at any time. And resources include both written documents and webinars, which are searchable via topic. You get to affiliate with ourselves as an organization in terms of visibility and branding with the use of our logo, discounts on learning opportunities, and also strategy and benchmarking, which I'll come on to talk to now in the next slide. So you probably have heard, if you've heard of our Diversity Champions program, you probably have heard of the Workplace Equality Index. So that is our leading benchmarking tool that is essentially a gap analysis tool with 8 strategic sections, which you can complete as a voluntary exercise if you are a member. You can also complete it if you're not a member, but you don't get the benchmarking meeting at the end of the year, which is the whole sort of the key to it in terms of using using it to inform your future EDI strategy. So the index is open online for 4 months to submit to. So it's actually just opening now and will run until October of this year. You can track your progress year on year according to strategic sections. You get support from your client account manager. We get about over 500 submissions, and have just this year launched our bronze, silver, gold awards. So essentially, completing the index looks like in the feedback meeting and an action planning session after the submission, which would be February to April next year, a detailed report for each section of the index, like good practice and where are the gaps that you need to close. And in addition, we now have launched our bronze, silver, and gold awards. So if you meet those criteria, then you also get one of those awards to be able to celebrate as an inclusive employer. To sort of get back to the earlier thing I mentioned around intersectionality, so race equity in our context really underpins everything that we do. We know LGBTQ plus people are not just LGBTQ plus, they're often women, people of color, neurodiverse, other strands of diversity, as it were. So at Stonewall, we are committed to racial justice in every fiber of what we do, and that exists in our processes, our means, and our outcomes. So we have reoriented the relationship we have not just with BMPOC staff, but with the wider QTPOC communities and the isolated who exist beyond our organisation. So parity for us will not just be achieved as an afterthought, but by placing racial justice at the heart of our work at every level. Very quickly, just to mention, because I'm conscious of time, organizations that tend to join the DC program are usually at least 50 plus in terms of staff numbers. If that isn't something that is according to your organization in terms of those numbers, then we also do one-off pieces of consultancy work with orgs, which is completely needs-led according to what it is you want to look at as an organization. So just to say, thank you very much for your time and for having Sarah and I today. And yeah, we are happy to be contacted after this, and our email addresses are just here. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think it's over to me now. Thank you so much, Sarah and Carla. Let me just get my slides on 1 second. Okay, you should all be able to see that. So hello everyone, thank you all for joining today, and thank you to Sarah and Carla for that session, a really great intro to Stonewall, who are a great organisation. I really encourage everyone to show them some support. I'm going to be kind of following on from that a little bit today, talking about LGBT plus inclusion in the workplace, and some kind of tips from my own experiences of things that you can do as individuals, but also that organisations can do. Before that, as we hopefully will go to the next slide. There we go. A little bit about me. My name is Jack Williams. My pronouns are he, him. There's a lovely picture of me. Please ignore my roots that were not dyed at the time. So I've spent about 6, maybe 7, time still doesn't feel real, years working across a whole different range of industries and a whole different range of kind of diversity themes and characteristics. More recently, I've been focusing specifically on LGBT plus inclusion, which is kind of where my expertise lies. If there's anything that today that kind of resonates with you, or if you like me, why wouldn't you? You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, where I'm very professional, or you can also follow me on Twitch, where I'm not. I'll be very transparent, I am here for the exposure, and I will be bringing it up again. So a little bit of context around what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start by kind of following on from some of what Sarah and Carla shared, and sharing some kind of data points around LGBT plus identities, what they look like within our industry, also what they look like externally, and then looking at why it's important to take action right now on LGBT plus inclusion, beyond the obvious, it's the right thing to do, but also what else, and then really identifying what are the opportunities for actions that we can take. So to start off with a few statistics, looking at kind of global representation of LGBT plus. So it's estimated somewhere between, the stats there are slightly different in the first point, 5.6% of adults in the US and 2.2% of adults in the UK identifying within LGBT plus. Personally, I don't necessarily know how accurate some of those stats are. I don't think that's entirely representative, but it will be interesting to see. Of course, in the UK, the census for the first time has asked questions around LGBT plus identities, so it will be really interesting to see what results come out of that. But regardless, I think it's important to note that attitudes are changing around LGBT+, and more people are identifying with those different identities within LGBT+, and particularly younger people, and we're seeing that much more across younger millennials, but also Gen Z. And I think we are starting to see more and more people identifying with that community. Looking then specifically at the gaming industry as an example, so if we take UK's industry census, that found that 21% of the industry are identifying as LGBT+, which of course is a much higher number than those statistics we saw a second ago, and shows that actually this industry has a high population of LGBT+ people. And that of course means that we need to make sure that we, as an industry, meet the needs of that community. But of course, the first part of that is to then understand the needs of that community. Of course, one of the things that we're aware of, just like some of the stats that Sarah shared, LGBT+ people do face barriers to inclusion within the workplace. One example of that is around kind of examples of mental ill health. Over 55% of trans people from UK census were reporting experiencing both anxiety and depression, which definitely is a statistic that I think needs to change. But equally, not necessarily industry specific, but research from business in the community found that a significant portion of LGBT+ people are facing barriers to being themselves in the workplace, just like Stonewall talks about. And that has a massive impact. And of course, the thing to note here is that those numbers start to rise when you look at this intersectionally. So those numbers are much greater when you look, for example, at Black LGBT+ people, or bisexual people, or LGBT+ people from younger age groups, which of course is another group that the gaming industry tends to attract, as we found from UK census. So what all this shows ultimately, I think, is that there is a definite need to make sure that the workplaces that we're creating are inclusive for LGBT+ people. And alongside that, it's important to recognise that we're making it inclusive for all LGBT+ people. We're not just doing it for the majority, but we're doing it for absolutely everyone, whatever their intersectional identities might be. So how do we do that? Well, we know that visibility can make a really big difference in the games that we're creating. And we've seen many examples of LGBT+ characters, LGBT+ stories being told, and the difference that makes. I know from my experience, the first time that I could be gay in a game was Fable, the original Fable, and you could marry a woman or a man. And sure, pretty much all of the men you could marry were like proper West Country, proper country bumpkin villagers, which perhaps has influenced some of the relationships I have today, but not the most diverse representation, but representation nonetheless. And I remember the difference it made to me as a young gay person who was just kind of working out who I was. It meant not only did I feel much more comfortable in myself, but also I was much more confident and able to engage with the story of the game I was playing. And I'm sure many of us have heard countless other stories from other people who have found similar things, young LGBT+ people who have been able to express themselves through games they're playing. The Sims is a really popular one. And the difference that it makes to the consumers of what we're creating in this industry. Of course, alongside that positive visibility, there does come a level of backlash, and we see this every single time that there is representation in games, not just for LGBT+, but across all forms of diversity. I mean, as much as there is this consistent historical accuracy, scientific accuracy argument that comes up, it always keeps coming back, even though it just is ridiculous, because these are literally made up worlds, and whilst some of these people might protest against this representation in games, and we see examples of this like review bombing, which of course happens in Last of Us 2, they are still engaging with these stories. I always find it quite funny when very obviously homophobic people are suddenly complaining because they have to play as a gay character, they have to be gay. I mean, I had to be straight for several years, and I am complaining, but we've all been there. So it has an effect, and when these people are starting to engage with these stories, whilst it might not be overt, it might not be drastic, that visibility that we're creating can start to change mindsets, and perhaps can start to have an effect over time, as long as we keep telling these stories, in changing people's minds. So if we apply that ethos around visibility in the content that we're creating to the way that we work as an industry, research from LGBT Great has shown that visibility really matters to employees and to consumers as well. People are looking for visible demonstrations of inclusion. We want to see it in the companies that we're working for. We want to see it in the companies that we're going to apply for. And also we want to see it in the companies that produce the products that we make, whether that's games, whether that's absolutely anything else. And equally, I think right now, public consciousness around inclusion, around diversity is at one of its highest, not just from, of course, the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, but here in the UK, there's been a huge increase in consciousness around trans and non-binary inclusion and what that means. And I think right now people are really looking at organizations, at companies, to make a statement around inclusion and show what they're going to do. So of course, visibility makes a difference. So we have to, if we want to start making a change, start being visible about the things that we're doing. But how can we actually work to create that visibility in our workplace? Well, for me, it's about a blend of these two things. Organizational advocacy, what are you doing as a company, as an organization to develop a more inclusive culture? Alongside that, individual allyship. What are you as a person doing to start to make changes in the way that you work day to day? I'll go through each of these in turn. Starting with organizational advocacy, it's about what you're doing as a company, like I said, using your platform, using your position to highlight the needs of underrepresented groups, to empower them, to make sure that they're being seen in what you're doing. Well, the first thing, of course, June is Pride Month, and I'm sure we've seen plenty of companies having rainbow logos, which is fine. I'm not going to tell you you're evil if you have a rainbow logo. If you only have a rainbow logo and don't do anything else, you might be a little bit evil, but there's hopefully not too many of them anymore. But what's important is that you're not just doing it at Pride as an organization. You're making sure that everything you're doing all year round is building representation. When you're producing a new ad campaign, you're making sure that it's representative or that it connects with LGBT plus people. You're making sure that the products you create have visibility within them, and you're doing it consistently and constantly, not just because it's Pride, everyone else is doing it right now. The second part of that for me is around data and making sure that you have solid data on who your employees are. A lot of firms are required to gather data on gender, and when I say gender I mean binary male and female, through pay gap reporting, but a lot of organizations don't gather data around just about any other diversity characteristic consistently. Of course, the problem that creates is then you're not able to properly understand and analyze the needs of specific groups within your company. If you have data on who are the LGBT plus people, you can cross-reference that with, say, an employee satisfaction survey and see, oh, okay, well, a large portion of this community are experiencing certain challenges. And that allows you to then address those barriers, but also to then tell a story about it. If you can back it up and evidence it with data, you can then really drive home externally the positive work that you're doing to make a change. And then the third part for me on organizational advocacy is around this sense of authentic leadership. And I've said senior leadership here, but I think actually anyone who is in a position of influence within an organization can do this. It could be, sure, a CEO, but equally, if you're someone who leads a team, if you're someone who leads a network, a group, if you're someone who manages one person, you have the opportunity then to influence others and encourage inclusivity through the work that you're doing. A really great example of this, I delivered a session a while back with a really large international organization, and the session was all about LGBT plus language, breaking down what do all these words mean, what are all these letters, what's going on, how do I talk about it? And we had at the end of the session, their European CEO come on, who was obviously someone really quite important within the organization, did a little 15-minute conversation. And at the very start of it, he said, I've never heard of a lot of these words before, but I've learned so much through this. And just by showing that willingness to learn, that vulnerability, whatever you want to call it, it suddenly showed everyone else that it was also okay for them to not necessarily know, to want to learn and to engage with it a lot more. And I think just through that visible leadership, whatever you want to call it, you can really start to make a difference organizationally. But you might not be someone who is, you might not be a CEO, you might not have, oversight of what your marketing campaigns are, you might not be a senior leader in the organization. So what can you do then as an individual to take steps to make that change happen and to start people talking? Well, I've put this as the first one, but for me, this point about understanding and really continually developing your understanding constantly is really, really critical. Not just if you're coming at this as an ally who's not LGBT+, but equally if you are as well. I'm constantly learning about new concepts, new identities, new terminology, and equally I'm a cisgendered gay man, so I don't know the lived experience of a trans person, for example, a bisexual person, a black gay man. But it's through learning and listening that I can then develop that understanding as an individual and work out how to better approach the situation. And there are countless ways you can do this. Of course, there's loads of resources online and it can seem quite scary at first, but I'd really encourage you to engage with LGBT+ media where you can. We saw in the UK, the series It's a Sin had a massive impact. There's various ways through social media as well that you can access LGBT+ experiences that can be really, really valuable just to get that snapshot into the lives of people who are different to you, which is really what this is about. The second point then is starting to take action, encouraging the conversation in others. It's on the one hand, talking to people about the things you're learning. If you've perhaps watched a show that's really been insightful and really gripped you, share it with people and encourage them to watch it as well, so that they can then also see those stories. But also it's about starting the conversations when they're difficult as well. And sometimes this isn't easy to talk about. But let's say, for example, you're working in marketing and building an advertising campaign. It's asking that question openly: how is this going to be received specifically by LGBT+ people? And really bringing that to the table. And that's a really great way to kind of become that ally, that advocate, and make sure that those voices that might not necessarily be in the room at the time are still being heard. And then the final thing is, what are those small visible things that you can do every day? And these acts don't have to be big sweeping gestures. You don't have to stand in the middle of a room and scream that you're an ally. You can try it might not work, but it's the small things that you can do every day to highlight yourself as an ally, as a supporter. I've put the example here around sharing pronouns, and we see more and more people start to do that because it just creates that kind of normalization of the concept. But equally, there are many other things you can do, highlighting yourself as an ally through statements that you're making, checking in with people, or seeking out industry or even cross-industry initiatives like, the Stonewall Diversity Champions program is a really great one, of ways where you can get involved in the discussion and start to engage. And really it's through a balance of those two that I think any company in any industry can start to make a difference to its culture and to those around it. That's everything from me. So thank you all so much for listening. You can follow me, like I said, on LinkedIn, or you can follow me on Twitch. You can send me an email if you want to talk about anything further, and I'll be here for the Q&A afterwards. One of the things that I didn't get to talk about today was around kind of employee resource groups and how they can be a really great way to engage, but luckily we have experts. I'm handing over to Becca, who is the founder and co-chair of the Pride Committee at Square Enix, as well as Kat, who is an admin of London Gaymers, who are going to talk all about employee resource groups. So over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm just going to share my screen now. Give me a second while I try and remember how to press the right buttons. Fantastic. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be talking about LGBTQIA+ advocacy and visibility in games. And Becca?
Hi, everybody. So I wish I could claim being the founder. I am in fact the co-founder of the Pride Committee at Square Enix, and I also work as a project coordination manager in the analytics department and do a lot of stuff to do with Japan.
And I'm Kat. I'm one of the admins at London Gamers. I head up the women, non-binary and trans subgroup, as well as working with all of our events and all of our many events. I also work at Square Enix as a digital analyst, so we actually work in the same department. Yeah.
So I'm going to define some of the key terms that we'll be using throughout this presentation. First of all, ERG is an employee resource group. So that means any sort of employee-led group for representing, usually, at least in our case, it's to do with some sort of minority or some sort of specific concern. So Pride team, a racial and ethnic diversity team, a team centered on helping mental health, employee mental health. Community group is an external group to the company. So this could be, for example, Stonewall earlier. Often they are a charity, often they are not-for-profit, and they can often be consulted for advice on various issues. And then last of all, since you guys are here, I'm assuming you probably know the acronym by now, and you've definitely heard it, but LGBTQIA+ is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual / aromantic, and the plus stands for everything else that has not been added, because if we kept going, we could be here all day.
Fab. So the first thing we're going to kind of talk about is what you can do if you already have a Pride group. So I'm assuming that there's probably going to be a lot of people who listen to this today who, you know, you've got a Pride group, you know, you've got some people who have set something up, but you're not entirely sure how to use it. So if you are a game designer, a dev, you're working on the game and you influence how the game looks and shows to the public. So that can also include like marketing teams. That can also include anybody who's kind of more outward facing towards the public. Pride groups are really, really good for getting those kind of insights of just sense checking that something's right. So recently at Square, we had a team reach out to, in fact, our Red Committee about a specific character, and would this character wear this sort of clothing and have this skin tone? Would this be a realistic name? And the Red Committee, which is the Racial and Ethnic Diversity Committee, were able to advise on those issues. And the LGBT Committee have done the same on other things that we can't talk about. But it's really useful because you can consult these teams who are your internal resource to try and get ideas about your in-game characters, your representation. Is this a good representation of your characters? Are your employees going to feel proud when they see this character out and about? And it's also super useful to kind of like ask advice on how to approach subjects and topics. For example, Pride Month, it's useful to consult your internal LGBT ERG groups. Same for Black History Month, it's useful to consult internal Black or racial and ethnic diversity groups. And this helps us as gamers and as game developers and game designers make better games and make our games be something our employees can really be proud of. On the flip side of this, if you are a team leader, you're HR, you're kind of working more on the making sure your employees work feeling comfortable. You can use these kind of ERGs internally to work out like how best to make your employees feel welcome and feel included. For example, we've recently managed to change our toilets, so we have more non-binary toilets. We've also managed to get pronouns put onto our Slack profiles, meaning that now everybody's pronouns are a lot more visible by default. These kind of things are the sort of things which can be really useful to have employee-led, because your employees will be there to tell you what is the most important thing for them at this specific time. But it also is useful for HR and team leaders to also work out what they can give back. If you have a Pride committee, you can kind of talk back to these kind of people and be like, hey, what can we give you? Can we give you funds? Like, is that going to help? Is having more diversity in the office, changing hiring practices? What can HR do to make specifically these underrepresented groups feel more welcome? Because if you have these underrepresented groups, they're going to tell other people to come and join the company. And so it's really good for your hiring, and it's just really good for everything. It just makes everyone feel better. Like more 21%, as Jack said earlier, 21% of people working in games are LGBT, which is ridiculously more than the average. 3% are trans and 2% are non-binary, which is massively, again, more than the average. Gaming is very gay. And if your companies, if you're working on games, you're working on designing them, aren't welcoming for LGBT people, there's other companies they're going to go to and they're going to end up at, which is not good for you or your games. Becca, I think you've got some best practices.
Yeah, I was just going to say, depending on what numbers you look at, the gaming industry is either 3 or 4 times the gay of normal life, which we like to say in the Pride Committee, just because, I mean, why not? So yes, best practice. Number 1, definitely don't wait to consult. ERGs are there, not all of them, but many of them are there to advise you on representation in games. There is no such thing as too early. There's absolutely no such thing as too early, because the sooner you get people in, you might be developing an LGBTQ character or a character who is an ethnic minority, and you have it all done. You're like, this hair looks great, and then you speak to somebody who is a person of color, and they're like, no, that's not a thing. You don't want to have to put all that work in and have to redo things. Another thing is definitely best practice. Best practice is empowering your teams, because everybody deserves a chance to speak up about how things make them feel and how their opinions, and empowering them by making them feel secure and making them feel that there is a safe space for them to speak is incredibly important. At Square Enix, we have a Pride channel, which is just kind of, it's everything from fun Pride related chat to, this thing happened and it really distresses me. How is everybody feeling about it? So it's a place where we can come together, especially important now in the time of COVID, when, you don't have the option of speaking to each other in the office. And it's also really important to make sure that the voices are listened to by developers. I think as a member of HR, it can often be, well, it's not necessarily your job, but it can be your job to make sure that other teams are aware that your employee resource groups are there to help them and there to, advise on what they want. I think the second half is yours, Kat. You're still muted.
It's always the case. The other thing that's important is that sometimes your employee resource groups will turn around and say, actually, I don't know about this. For example, someone might come to us, and bearing in mind, like Becca and myself are both cisgender white women, say, oh, I've got a trans person of color and I want to build that character. Can you advise on this? And we might go, actually, we don't know enough. And this is where external groups come into play. So there's groups like Learner Gamers, Balance Patch, Queer Represent Me, Jack, as he was mentioning earlier, can come consult on these kind of issues. Is this authentic? Is this good representation of characters? And these kind of things, I've also mentioned as well below a bunch of options. So Nana Nagesa, POC in Play, people like Tarami do very similar for Black, Asian, Arab, and other POC and ethnic diversity issues, because there is that big intersectionality there of you can have a really good representation of an LGBT character, but if you do really good on the gay stuff and then just mess it up on the rest of it, it can be really disappointing to see that like so much of it's gone and then it just falls down at the last hurdle. But the final thing to point out about this is that it's important to make sure that both your internal and external groups are compensated fairly and budgeted. So when some of our teams internally design their budgets and they work on their budgets, this is more like aiming at producers and designers and directors. But when they do their budgets, they put in a budget for these consulting. If you put it in early and you put it in when you pitch the budget, it's really easy to go and justify, oh, well, we've got this character, we have the budget, let's go and get external consulting. Let's make sure that these people have time to do it. Whereas it's much more difficult to kind of try and find that money later on to kind of work out where we're going to put it in. And to having these extra budgets early in is just so much nicer to be able to go, yeah, we've got the budget, let's spend it on this stuff. And that also balances for ERGs internally. If you're HR and you're working as a team lead and one of your employees or one of your direct reports is either starting up an ERG or currently working in an ERG, their time needs to be compensated fairly. So whether it's giving them extra, like a couple of hours a week to work on this stuff, or just having kind of like a verbal or written agreement to say, hey, just let me know when you need some time to deal with this, because there's nothing worse than having a bunch of game designers come to you and say, hey, I'd really love to get this idea, but you then don't have the time put in your schedule to actually have these meetings and have these conversations with them, which kind of makes that be a bit stop starting. So this is kind of all assuming that you actually already have an ERG, which is fantastic if your company does. But if you don't, how do you found one, Becca?
Before you switch to that, I did want to point out, also remember that, you know, consulting about representation, it's not just about not offending people. I mean, that's obviously the first hurdle. You don't want to make people mad, but it's also about, you know, people want to see themselves represented. They want to feel seen, and proper representation can add an element of realness to your game and authenticity, because it reflects the real world. But on the other hand, it's also a chance for you to represent the world as you want to see it. Honestly, the first step of acceptance is normalization. And the more representation, the more authentic representation we get of LGBTQ plus characters in games, the more it just becomes, oh, it's not even a thing. It's just another human being, which I think is one of the big goals of many minority groups. So yes, shall we move on to the next slide? I just wanted to say that, my idealist head. So how to start an ERG? I mean, there are many ways to do it. This is not an exhaustive list of steps to take, but definitely one of the first things you want to check is that there is not already one in another office. This definitely happened with one of the other offices who did not realize that we existed. Whoops. So yeah, it's good to check, not because you're going to need permission or anything like that, but because chances are, if they already exist, they're a few steps ahead of you, and they've probably got some pointers and warnings about potential pitfalls, etc. Secondly, speak to HR. There is a chance that if they are forward thinking, they already have a budget and they already may have some plans or some ideas of what they would like to see happen. Obviously, it's an employee resource group, so what does happen is up to you, but HR is skilled in navigating the politics of the company, so definitely make use of that. Secondly, come up with goals with what you want to do with the group. Do you want to have gender neutral bathrooms in the office? Do you want to be a very visible source of information and a very reliable place for people to come and, you know, ask questions? It's really up to you. There's no specific shape that it has to take. Do you want to mainly support other employees? Do you want to make a safe space? For us, at first, it was initially very much about supporting the employees and making a happy, comfortable LGBTQ plus space for employees to socialize in. Once upon a time when we were all in the office all the time. Second, and this is actually advice that we got after the fact, it's find an ally and a supporter and someone higher up. If you can connect with somebody who is presumably on a higher salary than you are, chances are not only will people listen to them, they're going to know people and they're going to be able to point you in the right direction. So if you can get somebody to support your initiative, it's kind of like having in America, having an after school club. You needed a teacher to support you. That's essentially what this is. And third, the third part of the second step is to start planning an intro to the rest of the company. It's up to you how you guys want to portray yourselves. Do you want to have like an all hands meeting and present your group then? Do you want to send out an email? Do you want to just throw a giant party and invite everybody? There's lots of options. Thirdly, and this kind of ties back to the first one, which is get funding. Once again, your company, especially HR, should have some money set aside for things like parties, Christmas parties or winter parties, summer parties, things like that. So chances are they can probably throw a little bit of that to you to do something as important as this. And this is a point, the next one is a point that Kat really feels very strongly about. I do too, but I've not worked in a company with tracked time, so I've not had to worry about it. If your time is tracked, ask for dedicated time. You're not just shirking your duties to go do this little gay thing that, you know, or this minority thing that just only applies to you. No, it's something that benefits the company as a whole. It benefits all the employees, it benefits the company as a whole. And you're doing it with the sanction of the company. Well, at least you should be. So therefore, you should ask for dedicated time. It's definitely something that they should be giving you. And last but not least, let everybody know that you exist. If you want people to come ask you about representation in their games, they have to know you're there in the first place. And once again, this can take many forms. You can intro yourself or remind people in maybe a monthly email or a monthly meeting, say, just so you know, you guys, we're here, you can come consult with us on any sorts of issues regarding to whatever it is that we represent. And if we can't help you, we can tell you who can help you. Once again, it's really up to you, but definitely get yourselves out there.
Fantastic. So this is kind of the almost last bit, and this is the point when, if you're HR, if you're want to start an ERG, just screenshot this, as it's kind of like a nice summary for everything. But like, you are not going to be the first ERG if you make one. You're not going to be, hopefully not the first in your company, hopefully not the first, definitely not the first ever. If your company pushes back on this, reference the fact that other leading studios are doing this and are getting a lot of good feedback. Like Square Enix, Google, EA, Facebook, Splash Damage. We've got a mix there of tech and gaming. These companies are doing this because it's important and because it shows actual manageable change. Splash Damage employed one person just purely to organize all of this, nothing else. Their entire job is just to organize this. And I mean, that's the dream for every company, but like, there's other people who are going to be doing this and you want to do this. And there's external groups that you can use. Once you've started your ERG, if someone comes to you with like this really niche issue and you're not entirely sure how to answer it, it's okay to go and reach out to other companies. It's also useful why you can get the budget first of all. But then the kind of like, I want to say the three kind of takeaway points from this that I would like everybody to take away, because it's great, is like, work with other groups representing minorities. We had so much usefulness when we've worked with the Red Group to work out like intersectionality between those 2 points. We've worked with the mental health group, like at London Gamers, we've helped before where we've had people who have got a Black ERG that have come to us to ask specific questions about an LGBT issue. We want get this intersectionality happening, and don't be afraid to just go and ask somebody else for help, because that's what everybody is always here for. And you always, if you're starting these things up, you normally want people to come and ask you for help, and everybody else who's doing this also wants to be asked for help. And take credit and make yourselves known. Like, literally, it's Pride, and now is the perfect time to start an ERG, because it's Pride and your company can do like a nice tweet about it, which is good for the company, but also is great for you because you now have the power to be like, let's get money, let's get a party, let's make sure that everything that we need gets changed. Like, if there's multiple of you, like, it's so much more easy to get everybody working together when you all know about each other. If you're the single gay in the company, you're probably, hopefully, not actually the only gay in the company, but it might feel like it sometimes, especially if you don't know people in other departments or in other offices. And so sometimes these kind of groups can kind of help find those kind of siblings that you don't know that you have.
We actually were the first employee resource group, at least that we knew of in our company. And it's also really important to remember, as Kat said, you know, we do empower each other. And one of the things that we have always, as the Pride group, tried to be there for is to support other ERGs when they came to us with questions about, well, how did you guys do this when you did it? Or how are we supposed to do this? And, you know, when you are the first, there are a lot of things that are still taking shape, and there are a lot of things that still aren't essentially formatted yet. There's no distinct specific way to do them. And you can definitely tell, you know, if the company is trying to say, oh, well, you know, this isn't how it's done, you can be there to say, actually, when we did it, that is how it was done. So how are we going to work this out? Support each other. It's so important. Intersectionality is so important.
I love intersectionality. It's the best. So thank you so much for listening to us. If you've got any questions about like how to start your own ERG or how to consult things, we'll be in the Q&A room after this. And on that note, I have a nice summary slide of everybody. So this is everybody that you've seen today. So Sarah and Carla from Stonewall, Jack who is an inclusion advisor, and Becca and myself, and the link to London Gamers. If you have any questions for how to consult an external group, feel free to do that. If you want to consult about an internal group, feel free to just like ping a message in the chat and we'll be able to pass on. I don't know if there's an email that's for both of us, but it's fine. And I think we're going to move over to, I can't remember if it's a different room for the Q&A or if we're staying here and it just transforms into the Q&A.
So sorry, just to hop on Kat, it would be a different room for the Q&A. So if everybody that wants to and can join the Q&A would be in the industry lounge just after this.
Fantastic. Cool. In which case, I don't think I've got anything else. Becca, I think you did have one thing more to say.
Oh, yep. Last but not least, I only feel comfortable promoting this because it is not something from which we are profiting at all. But as part of our work with the Square Enix Pride Committee, we have gotten out our Pride mascot on t-shirts and sweatshirts this year, and 100% of the proceeds are going to Stonewall in the UK and GLAAD in the US. So definitely check it out. I do believe the proceeds are going to these charities only for the month of June. So buy it this month. That's all. Also, the mascot is really cute. So thanks, everybody.
That's the nice thing. We'll see you guys in the Q&A sessions.